All right, mine shows that it is recording. First of all, let's start off with some questions. Y'all have any questions that I need to address?
Just real quick, Dr. Todd, in reference to that email from earlier today, this is Alan Wilson. Right. How am I supposed to get that Turnitin score?
Did Dr. Bullis not give you one whenever he told you? Okay.
No, he just told me it was good and submit.
Okay, if you will, and I'm going to send him another email and talk to him about it, because I've been trying to figure out, since this has happened to at least 3 of you, I've been trying to figure out how we can fix this. What I usually do is I will say your Turnitin score was 15 or 50 or 60. I think they want the score to be around anywhere less than 60 for the OMA. Some of them, they want it down in the 40s, some of them in the 50s, but because a lot of the OMA has some things that you've done before, I think they're allowing up to 60. So if it's higher than that, it's a concern. But what is happening, whenever you turn it into Dr. Bullis's, and if it has the Turnitin, the only way he can view that is through using Turnitin. But mine has 2 different places. It has a place where you're to turn it into, you're supposed to post it for the full thing, and then also you're Turnitin. So I've got to figure out how Dr. Bullis and I can keep this from happening for the rest of you that have not turned it in already. But what I usually do is when I look at it, and I will send you a note, I'll say your Turnitin score was, one of them was 15. And I said, that is great. That meant there was not a whole lot of copied material. What Turnitin is looking for is plagiarism. And it is looking to make sure that any things that are there are cited correctly, or it will pick up if you submitted task 1, 2 before, and this is in task 3, it'll pick up what you've written before, and that's why the numbers change. So if you submitted it to Dr. Bullis and he checked it before you submitted it to me, then when I get it, it's going to show 100%, which if I didn't know what was going on would make me think you copied somebody else's. But because I've run into this in the past, but we never have got to the point that it was copied twice, but some people turn it into their own Turnitin that they had through either their school system or something, and it will pick up higher scores that way. So what I need to get back in touch with Dr. Bullis, because we thought we had it solved, because he said, all I want to do is see their paper. I want to see the full paper. And I said, well, that's perfect. You need to look at the full paper. And I need to see the full paper. And then Dr. Lamb had told us back in the fall to go ahead and do the Turnitin score in the class. And he actually put a separate place. If you look at your shell, you'll see there's a separate place for it. So I don't know how we can solve it unless you turn it into my Turnitin before you do to Dr. Bullis's, and then you just don't submit to task stream until it is totally ready and he says it's a go. Now, to get to your question, how you can find it out, I sent my response to you to Dr. Bullis, hoping that he can go back in and pull up the exact Turnitin score that you had when he first checked it. So if he can do that, then we'll get it that way. But I apologize for it being confusing, because evidently I don't know how it got changed. I know that up until last summer, it was all done through the clinical coaches shell. But then in the fall, when I was teaching 603, Dr. Lamb said that he wanted it to go through the instructor's shell. and that's where he started putting in the Turnitin. So I don't know how we got to where we are right now, but I'm going to get back in touch with Dr. Bullis and say, okay, we got to solve this because it's not fair to the students. And so hopefully he will be able to give me what your Turnitin score was. And if it was below 60, there's not an issue. Occasionally, what I'm not sure whether it's picking up is the actual tasks. And when you put all the definitions in, all that kind of stuff, I'm not sure that it's not sending the score up higher for the Turnitin. But that's one of those pieces I'm not real sure of. But I know that there, you know, it only can be scored one time and turn it in. The second time it'll show 100%. And that would indicate if I didn't know what was going on and Dr. Bullis didn't know what was going on, that would indicate that somebody copied somebody else's paper. And that's not the case at all. But I do think that when you're taking things from one task, the more you copy, the higher the score is going to be. So I will get back in touch with Dr. Bullis. I sent him the response I did to you, Alan. And we actually had emailed before. We thought we had it taken care of, but I don't think he's going to be able to read yours until after it's gone through my Turnitin, or we're going to get the 100 each time. So I'll get back in touch with him again tonight after we finish and see if we can come up with a solution. But I think the solution is going to have to be you're going to have to post it on the class shell first when you put it together, and then post it to his. And then I will try to, right now I'm caught up. I've got everything reviewed that has been turned in. So I will check every day and try to stay at least up to date. And if there's an issue, I mean, so many of you are getting so close to finish that you're going to be finished before too long. And so we'll be finished all of this piece. But that's a good question, Alan. All right, anybody else have a question we need to talk about? All right, let's just look over the reminders. One of the things that I keep seeing in your task 4 is that I think you have confused the competency folio and task 4. They are not the same thing. Task 4 doesn't need the evidences. So if you're trying to give me evidences for task 4, then you're going to have everything from your internship. That's what goes in your competency folio. And Dr. Lamb has told the faculty, he said, one accreditation group wants to see the evidences, and that's all they want to see. And that's why he wants those in the competency folio. He said there's another accreditation group that doesn't want to see the evidences. They just want to see the narrative. And what they're wanting to see is that you can tie together the artifact, the work you did on the classes, the case studies, the content reading, all of those, and your internship. So it is to tie together, and it's to be your thought process about how those 3 components have helped you become stronger in whatever you have chosen as the competencies that you're reflecting on. So I think that's the biggest concern, and that's one of the things that we've dealt with every semester that I've taught this class. Well, not any of this 601, 2, or 3, is people are getting the competency folio requirements, which is the evidences, and almost all of that's going to come from your internship, and they're getting the task confused. And a lot of you, and it's fine if you incorporate both of them to do that. I don't care if you've got excess information, but what you really need to have, and I think some of you, if you don't do that, I think your final score in task stream, you'll probably get proficient, but it won't be nearly as high as it would be if you had actually done the reflection, because the evaluators are looking at what the rubric says is supposed to be there, and it clearly says all 3 of those you're to reflect on all three of those things. And I have seen some where you have defined the competencies, and you don't have to do that for the reflection. You're just to talk about it. And so that also, when you define the competencies as taken from the other, that's another thing that's going to push your Turnitin score higher. So just keep that in mind for those that haven't finished it yet. We've already talked about Turnitin. You can only post it to Turnitin one time.
Dr. Todd?
Yes.
I have a question. So task 4 is to be included in the final narrative. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Task 4, think of this as, and I usually talk about it this way. Think about the fact that you're putting a book together. You have your title page, you have your abstract. If you want to put a table of contents, you have your table of contents. You don't have to. Then you start with task 1, task 2, task 3, task 4, references, and appendices. So, you know, it's just like putting a book together, and each one of the tasks is like a different chapter. Okay. So, yes, task 4 has to be included in the total document, or it'll be sent back to you, most likely from your evaluators, because they will say that it's not finished. They're looking for all 4 tasks. They're looking for your references, and they're looking for any of the information that some of you have chosen to use appendices, some of you have included in the narrative, and that's fine. Either way.
Okay.
All right. Any other question before I move on to the next one? All right. Like I said, you can only submit to Turnitin one time. So I am thinking, and I'm going to send Dr. Bullis an email, that the best thing for you all to do is probably submit to the class shell, and let me see if I can share the screen and show you where I'm talking about. Okay. Yes, right here. All right, if you will notice over here on the side, you have your OMA assignment Dropbox, and then underneath that is the Turnitin check. So when you get your 5 posted together with your references, and you feel that you're finished and you made the changes that we've recommended, then post it here first, and then give me like that night and first thing in the next morning, and then post it for Dr. Bullis so that he can go back through it and read it. I will always give you what your Turnitin score is. When I look at it, that's really what I'm looking for, is your Turnitin score. And I will give you that. And I will also encourage him that if he hasn't been doing that, to make sure he tells you what it is as well. And that way he and I can be on the same page. So I think that will solve it. I'm not going to guarantee it, but I think it will solve it. But he and I do try to make sure we communicate, and that way we can keep from making your life really confusing. All right, right now, are you seeing the agenda? Is that what's on your screen? No, okay. Let me stop the first share. All right. Well, let me just go ahead and talk with you about, I told you that I want you to proofread your writing in your activities and anything you turn in, and that tonight I'd tell you why I think that's important. I am not an English major, but when I was in the central office, I wound up doing more proofreading, and so I've become rather good at it, and a lot of things pop out at me. Incorrect grammar, incorrect punctuation, incorrect spelling. One of the things that's going to happen to you if you become a school administrator, I can almost bet it will happen to you because it happened to us, is somebody in your office at the central level will get a copy of what you sent home with your name on it, and will have all of the errors marked that you made. Now, you think that that's ridiculous. Well, it may be. But there are some parents who feel that if you're a principal or you're a teacher, everything you send home should be letter perfect. And they will go through and mark everything wrong that you put in a letter home, a note home, or whatever, and they'll send it to your central office supervisor. I actually got a letter from a parent in the school system where I was working, and the parent said, "This came home from one of your principals. Notice the many grammar errors and spelling errors. This should not happen." Well, of course, I picked up the phone and called the principal and said, you know, you just need to be aware that this parent has, and I'm not even sure she signed her name. I said, but a parent from your school has sent this in and pointed out all the grammar errors. I got to the point that if we were sending anything out from the central office, I would get an English major or two to review it if I had time. Now, there's a few times you will not have time, such as if there's an accident and you need to get information home. But just be aware that when you get in an administrative position, and probably it's already happening because as a teacher, people also look at what you do. But when you get in an administrative position, the expectation is that you know appropriate grammar and you know how to write and that you know how to make a letter look appropriate. So that is why I keep encouraging you to proofread. Look for mistakes. One of the easiest things to do, and I do it, and almost everybody does it. You will be reading along what you're writing, and you read what you think you wrote. So when you haven't been working on it, I always suggest to step back, then read it, and you'll find a lot of your mistakes. Because we read what we want to see sometimes when we're working on it. And sometimes stepping back and looking at it, we'll find a lot of those mistakes. So that's why I say get in the habit, because people are judging you regardless of where you are working. And they're making judgments on any of the writings that leave your school, especially when you're at the central office or at the school level. So, you know, just take that ammunition away from them. Make sure that you've done a good job checking on that yourself. Now, you will still make mistakes. You will still not catch everything. And you know, that's just human error. We will read things, and even if you get somebody to proofread it, it's very likely that they'll miss some things too. But you can cut down on the number of errors, and that makes you come across looking more professional and that you actually know how to do things. One of the first things that I did as a principal is I had not been writing business letters since I was a high school student. So I bought a book of examples of different kinds of business letters. So you'll want to get things in your library that belongs to you that you can go back and refer to. You'll also want a good grammar book and keep a dictionary close by. Of course, with the internet, you can get a lot of that way. But those are some tools that as you become administrators, people are judging you for a lot of the wrong reasons. And a lot of those things you can take away from them by just simply spending a little bit of time up front before you send things home. So that's why you'll see a lot of things from me that says, okay, make sure you proofread this. I mentioned that if there was a group that was ready to talk about case study 2, that you could do that tonight. And I had Tisha, I believe your group 3 wants to make your presentation tonight. Is that correct? All right, Tisha, I'm going to let you go ahead and take over, and then her group, anybody that's on, can add comments. And let me see before I let you share. You all are looking at group 3 had to talk about the funding. Groups 1 and 2 did the Leandro case, and groups 3 and 4 were to do the PowerPoint regarding the superintendent's plan and the information there. So I'm going to stop this share, and then I'll let Tisha share on her computer and let them go ahead and present their PowerPoint or their presentation.
Okay. So can everybody see the screen?
I can.
No?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So we, the letter to the community. So as a group, we discussed the case study and talked about what we learned from the lesson plan of the role of the principal and chapter 2, resource allocation of financial planning. There were several thoughts. First, that the superintendent had the right motives in giving the principal control of the budget so that those working directly with the students can determine where the money can be best spent based on the needs of the students. However, because many details were left out of the letter, we were left with some questions and concerns about the superintendent's decision. And after only 1 year of a pilot program with 4 schools, it was decided to have every school go onto this SBB program. So we used bits and pieces from the letter to make explanation. So last year we laid the foundation to enhance the quality of funding decisions by piloting a system called system-based budgeting, or SBB, at 4 schools. They researched and piloted the program. It was only piloted for 4 schools for a year, and it was up to the principals to address any concerns from parents. We wanted to clarify what student or site-based budgeting was. It gives the authority to the principal to allocate funds among various line items in a budget. It involves all stakeholders, other administrators, teachers, and staff, and monies are distributed to school based on the number of students enrolled and the specific need of the students. One of the things we came into some concern about was in the book it had one thing, but in the letter it had another, and one was saying student-based budgeting and one was saying site-based management. Student-based budgeting is a system in which the funding is available to the school is based on the overall enrollment of the school. In its simplest form, it is an assigned dollar per pupil multiplied by the enrollment to determine the total budget allocation. So dollar times students equal to total budget. Whereas site or school-based budgeting or management is a system by which once some level of autonomy is given to site leaders, in other words, the principal, teachers, community, and budgeting process, this autonomy is not reliant on the former 2 movements. So it's not reliant upon the number of students and the needs at the school. So that was one of the things we were kind of confused about, but continuing on. So after listening to the principal in the pilot group and working through their concerns, we were rolling out the SBB this year system-wide. Our points were traditionally budgets are based on the number of students and staff. Traditional budgets did little to address the school and students' diverse needs, and every school has different needs. What this means is that we are literally putting dollars behind our stated goals to empower school leaders. Our points, it empowers stakeholders by allowing them to make decisions for allocation, make decisions for programs that directly impact the students, make decisions for positions that directly impact the students, and it allows for stakeholders to match the needs with resources. Our summary and summation: for the SBB to truly be effective, resources within the site must be distributed equitably. This requires stakeholders within the site working together using their knowledge to determine how resources impact student achievement. And then we noted information from lesson plan role of the principal. It states that according to that, the principal has a duty to make available the school budgets and school improvement plans. The principal shall maintain a copy of the school's current budget and school improvement plan, including any amendments to the plan, and shall allow parents of the children in the school and other interested persons to review and obtain such documents. In this case study, in the letter, the superintendent did state that the principal would be in touch with the parents in the coming weeks to explain how parents could be engaged throughout the budget process, ensure transparency, and do what was in the best interest of the student. This appears to be in line with what the role of the principal states it's supposed to do. Our concerns. According to Chapter 2, a budget will include the involvement of key stakeholders such as staff, board, parents, students, and taxpayers. Questions that came up was, did the superintendent decide, based only on talking to the principals at the 4 pilot schools, that the whole county would go to the SBB budgeting? Were there open school board meetings in which the public was invited and shown the data to support implementing this countywide? And was there data to show that this budgeting had made a positive impact on student learning? And did he talk to the teachers at the pilot schools and get their input and thoughts on the situation? Additional question concerns. According to Chapter 2, typically before a budget is passed, a draft is shared with the board, and after review, public comment or hearing, the budget is adopted. Sometimes the public votes on the budget. Most states require that the budget to be amended if there's a drastic change in it. Our questions and concerns were, did the superintendent go through this process? Did he have a public meeting or hearing? Was the budget amended and approved by the school board? Chapter 2 states it does little good for the district administration to allocate funds on a SBB basis, only to have the principal of a school arbitrarily allocate funds without involving other administrators, teachers, and staff. The key to a successful SBB is to let the staff closest to the instructional setting set priorities and allocate funds. Question was, did the superintendent make it clear to the principals that all stakeholders should be involved in the budget process? Chapter 2 also states that teams of individuals who actually provide the services are given decision-making authority and held accountable for the results. Question, is there any accountability piece built into the SBB? And the last question of concerns we had was, according to Chapter 2, audit 1995 successful SBB requires the cooperation of all stakeholders. It will not work in an environment fraught with solace where the math department is pitted against the English department for funds. Questions were, did the superintendent take into consideration that what worked for the 4 pilot schools might not work for all schools since the dynamics of every school is different? Was a 1-year pilot program enough time to produce enough accurate data to support making SBB a county-wide way of budgeting? And were the principals at other schools told how important it was to work collegiately for it to work or did the superintendent just assume that all schools would work collaboratively? And decentralization, it is the responsibility for all stakeholders to work together. In high school, budgets are usually centered around departments, and in elementary schools, budgets are usually centered around grade levels. And that concludes our presentation.
Okay, did any others of your group have anything they wanted to add to the discussion?
Well, I think that Ms. Ray, when we talked about it, you know, it was good when we had our conversation about it, because we obviously all had some different perspectives on that when we all came together. But we did have some common concerns, and I think Tisha addressed. I did want to add in there that you know, with and I guess from our understanding that the superintendent did I guess Tisha summed it up at the end. We kind of felt that from the principal aspect, as far as his role, that the superintendent kind of put everything back on the principal to kind of do a lot of things that we felt that was missing.
Okay, anybody else have anything to add from your group?
I think we pretty much covered it. I mean, our thoughts, we discussed it for quite a while, and I think we all agreed. I mean, for the most part, we did have some questions and differences, and some of us have more concerns than others, but I think for the most part, we summed it up in our PowerPoint.
Okay. Whitney, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I'm with them. We talked about it in depth, I think, and everything that's in the PowerPoint was what we discussed.
One of the questions that you all brought out, and I'm going to ask you a little bit different. Would you, as the principal, want all this responsibility? Would you want it to fall on your shoulders that you had to create this budget that looked after the needs of everybody in your school? And, you know, do you have the financial planning background? Most of us don't. Some of us have a good head for math or a good head for business. We can handle it better than some others. But would you want that responsibility? And would you want something like this thrown at you?
I think it would be very difficult, because it's already, as a principal, I think it's very difficult, especially if you're a new principal, to create a culture of just cooperation in your school. And when you throw money into the pot, it makes it more difficult, because especially if you're in high school and you have, like they talk about the silos of English department, you know, against the math department. I think then they start getting mad because you, as the principal, maybe gave more money somewhere else than you did to them, and then that just causes more issues.
And I agree with you. You know, I was thinking about when I was a principal. Now, in North Carolina, and I'm assuming it is the same in most places, most states, the schools are allotted funds based on the number of students that they have in their school. And then there is additional money if a school is got a lot of Title I or a lot of issues, then there's additional money that's allotted for certain things. So, you know, as I was looking at this, and it's a good thing to talk about, but I was wondering, just, is it looking at zero-based budgeting where you have to think for everything at the front end and make that in your requests? If that is, you'd have to think of school supplies, you'd have to think of your phones, you'd have to think of your fuel oil, you'd have to think of paper, copier expenses, you know, so many things that are just basically operational would have to be thought of on the front end. In addition, did you have to plan for the personnel, or is that going to come to you? In North Carolina, for most teachers are state paid positions, and the positions come to the school system based on the number of students in the school system. And then the school system allots them to the schools based on the number of children in each school. So, you know, I looked at that and I thought, well, it sounds like a good concept, but if I were the principal, I'm not sure I would want to be in on the ground floor of this. I would want to see it tried a little bit before we jumped into it as a whole school system. And yes, they tried it for 1 year. Most things will work for 1 year because people know they're doing something different. It's called the old Hawthorne effect. If somebody knows that they're being watched, then they do better. But that doesn't give the time for the newness to wear off. So I think you brought up some good points. You brought up some really good questions. Does anybody else have anything to add to that? We'll have one other presentation next week on this one, and then the other two groups will be presenting about the Leandro case, which was dealing with the North Carolina county.
I had a question. One of the things that I wondered about, and it's just because I simply don't know, is if a superintendent did decide to do that with the whole county, would he not need to go to the school board and have it approved, or is that just something he can decide on his own like that?
No, superintendent in North Carolina, and I suspect most school systems, they're going to want the board to approve anything like that. Because it is a different way of doing things, and so you better have your board's approval, or you might be a very short-lived superintendent in that system.
And the other question I have, I'm sorry.
That's good. Go ahead.
The other question I had was, is it typical for each school to have a different type of budgeting process, or does each school typically in a county have the same type of budgeting, or do they normally leave it up to the principal?
typically, with no more funds than most schools are getting and no more funds than most school systems are getting, typically what happens is everybody uses the same process. And I will go back to when I was the superintendent. I would tell my principals starting in January to get to me a list of their major school capital prop issues, which is your roofs and your flooring and, you know, anything to do with the building. And then I would tell them, you know, what is it that you need as far as a focus at your school that will help with your teaching and with your students' learning. So they would, usually by February, they would send me their wish list of things that they wanted included in the local budget. Now realize that in North Carolina and most states, most of your funding comes from the state. There is some funding that comes from the federal government, and those are usually for specific programs such as Title I, career and technical education, exceptional children, school food service. So that's usually your federal money. And then you have the local money. The local money is usually for upkeep of the buildings, paying of the janitors, the secretarial staff, and getting your supplies and some of your supplies. Some of it comes from the state level, but the funding is threefold. And the only thing that the school systems have an opportunity to request money for is for the local budget. So, you know, that's why you ask them about their building needs first. And then if there's anything that the local community pays for, and it's usually janitorial staff and clerical staff that they pay for, and they'll usually do a little bit of a supplement. Most local governments do not, especially in rural areas, do not see it as the job of the locals to give a supplement. But because everybody's doing it, they've agreed. But a lot of the local, especially rural areas, will say, we will not fund past 4%, 5%. You know, they'll have a percentage that they'll say we'll fund a supplement for, but no more than that. So I would start in January and ask the principals to give me the information that needed to go into the local budget. Then we would work on one sometime, usually in February or March. We would have a board meeting for discussion of what the board's priorities were for what they were going to submit to the county commissioners. And then we would come up with that, and then my finance officer would take those priorities and what we had done the previous year, and then she would get with the maintenance director and take what his priorities were for building needs, as well as the priorities that the principals had turned in, and then they would create a budget to present to the school board. And then at that point in time, the school board would look over it. The principals would have an opportunity to look over it. And then usually by April, the end of April, they would have to adopt what they wanted to send over to the county, because the county usually had a date around the end of April that they wanted to see your budget requests. Now, some of them requested it earlier than that, but most of the time it was by the end of April. And then the county would work on it between May and the end of June. The state law says that the county is to pass their budget by the 30th day of June. I have actually attended Friday night county commissioners meetings when there was next to no one there except you know, they had to have it passed, and it was Friday night before the 30th was on maybe Sunday, or it was the 30th, and they had to have their budget passed. And sometimes I thought that they were meeting just to keep anybody from coming that late, but you know, some of us would show up anyway if we had an interest in it. Sometimes it was the sheriff and me and the social services director. We might be some of the only ones there, but we just basically wanted to be there to see what they cut from us, because they were never going to give us what we asked. And so And it is getting to the point in some systems that the county commissioners are telling the schools what they can spend the money on. And so I think that I was fortunate enough to work with an excellent county manager. And he and I worked together, and then we let our boards work together. I did not try to work with the county commissioners. I worked with my Board of Education. He did not try to work with my Board of Education. He worked with his county commissioner because he had the same level job that I did. He worked with his commissioners. I worked with the Board of Education. So if he and I could work together and we understood each other, then a lot of times we could get a lot accomplished. And then a lot of times there's tension between the school board and county commissioners. And it's because many times the county commissioners do not have the funds that the school system thinks that they've got available to them, because they may have many issues going on. And so when those are the kinds of things happening, there's always a rub, and it's very difficult. But that's the budget process. And then the state, whenever they finally pass the budget, I actually worked one year when the state didn't pass the budget till the end of October. And we were guessing on how many teacher positions we were going to have. And finally, they did make a concrete, this is the number of teaching positions you're going to have by around the 1st of September. So we could get our teaching positions in, but we did not know about assistant principals because it's a lump sum money that came for administration. We did not know about media and some of the other areas because guidance, because those kind of come in a lump sum as services. So depending on whether the state actually passes their budget, you can work 2 to 3 months without a lot. With no materials and supply money, and all the money we had coming in was just for those teacher positions and the few state positions that they had said, this is what you will have. It is not fun like that. Everybody thinks that you should be doing what needs to be done for the school, but you can't without the money. And when they don't pass a budget at the state level until September, and then by the time they pass it in September, it's the middle of October before you actually get the breakdown and exactly what you've got. And then you have a board meeting that's in November before you can get your whole budget passed because you don't know what you've got. So it can be difficult when you're dealing. Now the feds, they always send their money at the first of the year, and it's specified for specific things. So you know what that is. It can change. Sometimes they will send you an extra allotment, or sometimes they'll say, okay, your school system no longer your school system no longer fits this requirement, so therefore you're not going to get that money. But they don't usually do that. But the local and the state are the two that usually fund most of the things that happen in your school system. Did that help you understand the process? I do think if you're thinking about going into administration, if you ever think that you will work at the central office level, I would encourage you to at least attend 1 or 2 county commissioners meetings when the school board is presenting their budget, just to see how it goes, because different communities handle things differently. I think overall your larger systems, your big city systems, probably have a better handle on it and probably don't have as much individual attention from boards as some of your more rural. Some of the more rural are now saying, this is what we will pay for. And so I think that when you have those things going on, you just need to be aware of what you're dealing with. It sometimes it's not a pleasant thing. All right, anything else about budgeting or anything that would be helpful to you with understanding how the budget's put together? All right, I want us to, we've got 15 minutes. And I specifically put some questions here for you because I wanted to see when I read your answers to the discussion boards, that's when I realize what you do or do not understand. So I came up with a bunch of things after listening to or reading your responses to activity 6. It made me realize we really need to talk about this, because if you're going to be a school administrator and you're going to be caught with having to deal with some of these situations, or you're the supervisor and an accident occurs, you need to know exactly what you need to be doing. So regardless of whether it's the bus driver's fault or whether the bus was hit by someone else, and that's more often what happens, is somebody hits a bus. School buses are constructed so well that most of the kids are not going to have anything but superficial wounds, or they may have a slight where they hit their head, where they bounce up and they hit their head on the top of the bus or something if it tips, or they hit a big bump or something like that. But most of the time, the children on the bus are going to be okay, as well as the adults that are on the bus, unless something happens with the bus driver. But when an accident first happens, what should you as the teacher supervisor on that bus do? What's the first thing you should do?
So clearly, immediately, you're going to check to make sure everyone's safe, both from the accident, and then you need to evacuate the bus and get everybody out to a safe distance, removing them from the roadway and ensuring everyone's out of harm's way.
That is correct. And then at some point, either if the bus driver has communication, someone needs to call 911, and it needs to be done immediately. And a lot of times, if it is a bus accident, that will happen because parents will come along and they'll see it and they'll call 911 immediately. All right, once you've notified 911, who else needs to be notified specifically?
Probably I would think that the whoever is the principal of a bus at our particular school,
whoever is over the buses.
Right.
Chances are you would need to call the central office bus supervisor for whatever school your bus is coming from. And then the other person is you make sure that the school principal knows.
Yes.
Now, these next questions are things that most of the time you're not going to think about unless your school system has had an accident and they went through that and they know what they didn't have. The information that you're going to need to file with the school and give to the police is one of the first things that they will ask you when the policeman comes to the scene of the accident is, where was everybody sitting? Now, if the bus is not very full, you can remember that and you can deal with that. But if you've got a totally full bus, then you've got to figure out a way to get that information. Now, why would that information be so important? Why is it required?
So they can ensure where everybody was located when the accident took place. I've actually lived this because this past year we had a bus accident and I had to go out with the assistant principal, and we had a sheet of paper and we had each kid, we had the rows, and each kid had to write their name and where they were, where they were sitting at in the row. It's a very intense process.
It is. You're exactly right, Alan. And what you said is exactly correct. The trooper or the sheriff's office, whoever comes upon the scene, the town police, whatever it is, they're going to want to pull out this accident report that lists exactly where everybody is sitting on that bus. Now, if someone is hurt and they have to go to the hospital or they have to go to a doctor, who is it or where is it that those reports go to for payment?
I guess at our school, the reports that have to be filed, the school incident report is by it's usually by the principal's secretary.
All right.
If
And
that's what you're talking about.
that's part of it, but
We have
that's where the first piece goes. The second piece is, most of the time, if it is a bus accident, then it goes to whoever the bus driver or supervisor for the system is. Now, do you know why they need it?
To decide who's at fault, possibly?
Nope. The Attorney General's office is the one that gets the bills when there's a bus accident. So you have to get the information from the parents and let someone be in charge of collecting all that information and get it sent to the appropriate people at the Attorney General's office. And that's something that's totally different from, you know, if you're in a car accident, you call your insurance company and they handle it. Well, if it's a school bus, the Attorney General's office is the one that handles it for you. And so that's why so much of this paperwork is needed and why it has to be accurate. And then when the bills start coming in, you need to make sure that the parents know to bring those bills to the school system at your school, and then you would pass them on. And it may be different in different counties too. They may have someone else who does it other than the transportation secretary. But a lot of times it'll be the transportation secretary because they will have the information. Also, what needs to happen whenever those kinds of things happen is there should be a phone call going to every one of the children's parents that's on that bus just as soon as possible, followed up by a written letter that tells them where they need to submit. If their child had to go to the doctor, where they need to submit their information to. And you usually want it submitted to the school, and then the school, some particular person at the school, and then the school then will pass it on to the appropriate people. So, you know, that way you let everybody know what's going on. I actually dealt with this as well more than one time when I was the superintendent. And if the accident was close to the school, then of course you expect the principal and or assistant principal to go and be there to help whatever group of adults are there to take charge. If it happens to be in town, as one of ours were, then I could get there faster because my office was located in the town. I could get there faster with my assistant superintendent and the principal of the high school to get there. So we went there, and then by the time they got there, there was one or two children that had to be transported to a hospital. And I felt that it was more important for the principal and assistant principal to go with the children that were going to have to be taken to the hospital. So I would send them with them, and the ones that were just being checked out at the emergency room. At that time, we had a local hospital. We don't anymore. Then my assistant superintendent and I went over to the hospital and stayed there until the parents picked up their children. So, you know, there's all kinds of things that are going on that you're having to deal with. The most important thing for you to do is to remain calm and keep a cool head. And there will be a lot of people who will come and want to help. Don't turn those children over to anybody unless they are an EMT or a fireman that is a first responder. Then you can step back out of the care role. And when the one happened in town that we were dealing with, if there were children that were hurt, we let them know which ones, we already had them off the bus, and we let the ones know which were hurt. And so the fire department was the first ones on the scene, and they determined which ones needed to be checked by the EMTs. They checked them, and they determined whether they needed to go to the hospital. So you don't let them leave unless they are going with an ambulance to the hospital, unless they are signed out by a parent. And you have to make sure it's a parent that signs them out. That way your liability is not an issue. So there are so many little things that until you've lived it, you won't be ready for it, but keeping a cool head, making sure you know who to call, and then being there and checking on the children, all of those kinds of things will make everything go a lot smoother, and it will make for less upset people to deal with. I've actually been to some of the scenes when it was high school students and there weren't many on the bus, and nobody was hurt at all, and they just wanted to get to school. And so, you know, soon the bus couldn't move, but we could send another bus. And so when I was there, I'd call the principal and I'd say, send us another bus. Your students are fine. They don't want to be, you know, the fire department has cleared them. The EMTs have looked at them. There is no issue. They want to come to school. Will you send another bus to come pick them up? And so that's what they would do. So, you know, like I said, in most situations, there's not going to be a lot of people hurt on the bus side. It will be minor injuries. There can be some major injuries if students are crossing the road and a car hits a student. That's a totally different situation, but it's one where you really need a cool head and looking after that. All right. Have I helped you to understand sort of what needs to be done in the case of a type of emergency where you're supervising any type of situation where there's been some injuries in a bus accident? Has that helped? Do you have any other questions about that? Because I've gone over these hurriedly because I'm looking. We're about 3 minutes left in our hour. Any other thoughts about the bus situation? All right, we're not going to have time to talk about these, but I want you to look over the notes that I have and about the student discipline, because this is one of the things I want to talk about. Two things particularly. Zero tolerance policies, while they sound good and they make a statement, think about the fairness and reasonableness if you have the same thing for a K-5 student, a 6-8 student, and a 9-12. So just think about that. We're not going to talk about it, but I want you to think about that. And then other thing I want you to think about is when you are a classroom teacher, and this is one of the things that most classroom teachers don't understand, about the only things that a principal has that a classroom teacher doesn't have as discipline or form of discipline is in-school suspension, out-of-school suspension. That's about the only two things that a principal has that a classroom teacher doesn't have. The expulsions are usually left to the determination of the superintendent. Most of the situations about whether a child needs to be removed from your school to an alternative school in most counties has to go through a committee. So it takes, you know, it's moving them from their normal place to another place. So those are about the only things that a principal has or a central office person has that the teacher doesn't have. So teachers often don't understand that they have as much control in their classroom, and the more that they give away, the less control they're going to have. And that's hard for you to teach teachers, because sometimes the easiest answer is to get them out of their classroom. But is that really the best answer for the teacher and the student? Yes, sometimes they need to be separated from each other, and a few minutes away in the office for a little while is fine. I'm not saying not to send them to the office, but I'm just saying that you need to understand that a principal only has in-school and out-of-school suspension that's different from what a teacher can do. And the only thing that a superintendent's got is expulsion. And, you know, that usually has to have a lot of things behind it. So I know that's very quick. And if you've got any questions about that, if you've got a burning question right now, ask it.
I have one, Dr. Todd. It's Rose.
Okay.
Hey, I was just wondering, so do we just, the rest of the groups, do we present next week?
Yes.
Or okay.
Yes, all of you present next week. Tisha's group was ready, and if you notice, that was one of the things I put on the agenda. If you have a group that is ready, then I'll let you present. So yes, and that way you will also shouldn't be rushed with your presentation since we've already got one of them over. Any other questions?
Okay.
Good question. All right. If there's some of the things that I stated that you want me to go into further, or you have some questions about the student discipline notes that I put on your agenda, if you will send those to me, then I'll make sure we address them next week after. We'll do questions first, and then we'll do our 3 presentations, and then we'll address any questions that you have. Well, what I try to do to give information is when I see there's confusion, then I try to bring those out and try to bring out the highlights of what you really need to be thinking about in when you place yourself in the administrator's role. And so that's what I'm trying to do. Or I'll look at some of your readings and I'll think, okay, this is really important for them to know. And I will mention that. All right. Any other things for tonight? Anybody need to ask me a question after I end the meeting or stop the recording? All right, I'm going to stop the recording, and I hope you all have a great week. And I know next week is 4th of July week, but I still hope you'll have a wonderful week in addition to having a restful day on the 4th of July.